The town of Cutter's Creek, Wyoming, had a long memory and short patience for women who didn't fit the shape it had decided on. Maren Voss had never fit that shape. She had known this since she was 14 years old, and already managing the books for her father's blacksmith operation, while the other girls her age were learning needlepoint and the particular art of making themselves agreeable. She had not been disagreeable. Exactly. She had simply been other things first and agreeable somewhere further down the list, and Cutter's Creek had noticed. By the time she was 29, the town's opinion of her had settled into something almost official. She was too direct, too competent, which people said with the tone of a compliment that wasn't, too unbothered by the fact that she was 30 miles from anywhere and running a livery stable alone, which her father had left her when he died of a fever 3 winters back, along with 11 horses, a mortgage she had since paid off, and a reputation for being the most capable person in Cutter's Creek that nobody had quite figured out how to give her credit for. She was 5'8", which was not remarkable in the way that Maggie Calloway's height had been remarkable in Texas, but which was, in Cutter's Creek in 1883, enough to put her at eye level with most of the men she dealt with, and which some of them found uncomfortable for reasons they couldn't name and expressed, as men do, as something else entirely. She had dark brown hair she kept in a long braid because a braid stayed out of the way, and she had never had much interest in things that didn't serve a purpose. Gray eyes that were direct without being cold, hands that showed the work she did. She had never been self-conscious about any of this. She had been proposed to once, at 26, by a cattle buyer named Pruitt, who came through twice a year, and who had told her, in what she gathered was meant to be a romantic declaration, that a woman who understood horses the way she did would be an asset on any ranch. She had declined, politely and without drama, and he had looked genuinely confused, and she had gone back to checking a mare's left rear shoe, and that had been the end of it. The town had drawn its conclusions. The town always drew conclusions. They accumulated not all at once, but in the way that water gets into old wood, slowly and then everywhere, and the conclusion Cutter's Creek had reached about Maren Voss was that she was simply not the kind of woman a man could settle with. She was too much her own person, too set in her ways, too satisfied with her own company, which they meant as a criticism, and she received as an observation that was largely accurate. What they didn't know, because she didn't tell them, was that she was not entirely satisfied. There was a specific quality of quiet that came down in the evenings when the horses were fed and the stable was locked, and she climbed the stairs to the small apartment above it that had been her home her whole life. It was not loneliness exactly. It was the awareness of an absence whose shape she could sense without being able to describe it. She had stopped expecting Cutter's Creek to fill it. Cutter's Creek had shown her most of what it had. She was wrong about that, too, though she wouldn't know it until a Monday in April, when a man came through her stable door leading a bay gelding with a stone bruise and a tired expression that matched his horse's. His name was James Aldridge. He was 36 years old, lean in the way that outdoor work makes a person lean, with weathered hands and dark eyes that took in the stable the way a person trained to assess things takes in everything, quickly and without making a production of it. He had come to Cutter's Creek because the town's new physician, old Dr. Farley, had retired in February, and the county had put out a posting that had eventually reached him in Cheyenne, where he had been practicing medicine for 4 years after 2 years in Denver, and 3 years before that in the field hospitals that followed the cattle drives north. He was not what Cutter's Creek had been expecting in a doctor. He was quieter, more observant, less interested in the social performance that small towns require of new arrivals, the handshaking and the assurances, and the careful management of first impressions. He had come to work, and he had a horse that needed attention before he could do anything else, and someone at the general store had pointed him toward the Voss livery without any particular warmth. Maren was in the middle stall when he came in, checking the bandage she'd re-wrapped that morning on a gelding belonging to the Hollowell farm. She heard the door and straightened and looked at him and the horse he was leading, and read the animal's condition in about 4 seconds. "Stone bruise," she said. "Left front." He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "Since yesterday morning. How far did you ride him on it?" 6 miles, he said. "I walked him the last 2. She came out of the stall and crouched by the gelding's left front and lifted the hoof without asking permission because she didn't need it. She examined what was there and set the hoof down and stood. "He'll need a few days off it," she said. "I can poultice it tonight and again tomorrow. He should be sound by Wednesday if you don't push him." "I won't," he said. "You'll need a horse for the days he's resting," she said. "I have a reliable gray I rent out. Even-tempered, good feet, used to different riders." "That would suit me," he said. "I'm the new physician, James Aldridge, Maren Voss," she said. "This is your stable account as long as you're in Cutter's Creek." He looked at her with the particular attention of someone who is genuinely observing rather than performing observation. "You run this yourself?" "Yes," she said. "Since?" 3 years, she said. "Before that, I ran it with my father." He nodded. "Not the nod that means I'm processing what to say next, but the nod that means I understood what you said and I found it sufficient." It was, she would think later, an unusual nod. He paid for the first week in advance, which she did not ask him to do, and which she noted. He left with the gray, and she settled his bay, gelding into the end stall, and began the poultice, and did not think about the new physician more than was warranted, which was to say, she thought about him a reasonable amount for someone she had just met, and then put it aside, because she had work to do. He came back Tuesday to check on the bay. She was in the yard when he rode up on the gray, and she watched him ride with the automatic assessment of someone who evaluates horsemanship the way others evaluate character, which, in her experience, was not entirely different. He rode with an economy of movement that told her he'd spent time in the saddle, not for pleasure, but as a working matter, the way people who have covered ground on horseback, for reasons other than recreation, ride. "He's doing well," she said, before he dismounted. "You can see him, but I'll tell you what I told you yesterday. Wednesday at the earliest." "I trust your judgment," he said. People said that. She had learned to read the difference between the ones who meant it and the ones who said it while already preparing to disagree. He meant it. She showed him the bay and let him satisfy himself that the horse was comfortable and the poultice was doing what it should. He asked 2 questions, both of them good ones, the kind of questions that told her he had some knowledge and was working to extend it rather than to demonstrate what he already had. She answered both directly. On the way out, he stopped by the gray's stall and checked her feet out of habit, running his hands down each leg the way a careful horseman does, and Maren observed this and said nothing. "She's been going a bit short on the right rear," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm watching it. Nothing to worry about yet." He looked at her. "You knew I know every horse in this stable," she said. He smiled briefly. "I believe you," he said, and left. By the end of the first week, the town had noted that the new doctor came to the livery more often than horse medicine strictly required. The bay gelding was sound by Wednesday, as Maren had said he would be. James Aldridge kept the rental agreement on the gray anyway, which was an arrangement that made practical sense if he was making calls in the county, and less practical sense as his primary reason for appearing at the Voss livery on Thursday afternoon when he had no calls scheduled, and the bay could have managed perfectly well. He brought her coffee. He had stopped at Mrs. Baxter's bakery on the way, which was something she learned later was unusual for him because he did not, as a rule, stop at bakeries. He handed her the cup and said, "I didn't know how you took it." And she said black, and he said, "Of course," in a tone that was not dismissive, but that seemed to find this information entirely consistent with what he already knew about her. They talked for an hour on the stable porch in the cold April afternoon. He told her about Cheyenne and Denver and the field hospitals and what it had done to his understanding of medicine to work in conditions where you had what you had and nothing more. She told him about the year after her father died, the month where she had not been sure she could manage the mortgage and the stable both, and how she had sat down one night with the accounts and a pencil and worked it out until she saw a way through, and then done exactly that. "You weren't afraid," he said. "I was afraid," she said. "I did it anyway." He looked at her in the way he looked at things he found genuinely interesting. "That's most of what competence is," he said. "People think it's the absence of fear. It isn't." She looked at him. "You've thought about this?" "A fair amount," he said. The town's observation continued and intensified, because small towns are consistent in this way. Theodora Hatch, who ran the millinery on 3rd Street, and who had an opinion about everything and the energy to share it, was the one who got there first with the new doctor. She found him at the post office on a Friday morning in his 2nd week. He was a careful man, she said. He might not know what he was getting into with Maren Voss. He listened to this with the patience of a man who had spent years listening to people tell him things they believed he needed to hear. Then he said, what was it she felt he needed to know? Maren Voss was a fine woman, Theodora said, but she was set in her ways. She had no softness to her. She had turned down Pruitt, which everyone in town knew, and the feeling was that she had done so because she was simply not built for the ordinary life that a woman in her position ought to want. She ran that stable like a foreman. She had no patience for social niceties. She was, in short, more than any one man was likely to manage. James Aldridge thanked Theodora Hatch for her concern. He collected his mail. He said, on the way out, that in his experience the question was not whether a person was too much, but whether the person doing the measuring had the right scale. Theodora was not entirely sure what he meant by that, and he did not elaborate. He told Maren about it that afternoon. He told her because he was not a man who kept things, and because he thought she had a right to know what was being said, and because he was curious about what she would do with it. She was checking the Gray's right rear, which had been nudging at her attention all week. She didn't look up. What did she say, specifically? Maren asked. He told her. She was quiet for a moment. Then she set the hoof down and stood and looked at him with the gray eyes that were as direct as anything he'd encountered in 3 states. She's not wrong about most of it, she said. I know, he said. I am set in my ways, she said. I do run the stable, like a foreman. I turned Pruitt down because he wanted a ranch asset, not a wife, and I'm not interested in being an asset. No, he said. I don't imagine you are. She looked at him for a moment. You're not concerned, she said. It was not quite a question. I spent 2 years in field hospitals, he said, patching people together with what I had. I learned to value people who do the actual work and don't make a performance of it. He paused. You're the least performative person I've met in Cutter's Creek. That's not a problem for me. That's the point. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she went back to the horse, but not before he had seen something in her expression that she hadn't quite managed to keep off her face. He was, she decided, a disconcertingly observant man. This was consistent with him being a physician. It did not make it less disconcerting. The Gray's right rear turned out to be the beginning of a longer conversation. Maren had seen what she suspected on Wednesday, confirmed it Thursday, and on Friday morning she made a decision that a less confident person might have hesitated over. She sent a note to James Aldridge at the clinic he had set up in the rooms above the hardware store, asking him to come by when he had time, that she wanted to show him something. He came at noon. She showed him the Gray's right rear hoof, the very early signs of a crack working up from the edge, barely visible, the kind of thing that would be nothing if caught now and significant if left another 2 weeks. I'm telling you because it's your rental horse, she said, and because I'd want to know. He crouched by the hoof and looked for a long time. He had, she noticed, the ability to look at a thing carefully without feeling the need to speak while he was doing it. This was rarer than it should have been. What's the remedy? He said. She told him. Corrective shoeing, restricted work for 10 days, a specific approach to the angle of the shoe that she had learned from a farrier in Laramie, who had been doing this longer than she'd been alive. You learned that in Laramie? He said. I went to Laramie specifically to learn it, she said. 2 years ago. There was a horse here with the same problem, and I didn't know what to do, and I didn't want to guess. So I found someone who knew, and I learned. He stood and looked at her. You went to Laramie, he said, because a horse needed something you didn't know how to give it. Yes, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I went to Denver for a year before I went to Cheyenne, specifically because there was a surgeon there who had done work on abdominal injuries that nobody else was doing, and I needed to learn it. I had a patient I couldn't help in the way he needed, and I couldn't let that be the answer. She looked at him. He looked at her. You went to Laramie for a horse, he said, and there was something in his voice that was not amusement, and was not admiration exactly, but was something between the two that she did not have an immediate name for. It was a good horse, she said. He laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that doesn't plan itself, and she found, unexpectedly, that she liked the sound of it very much. They were seen walking along Cutter's Creek the following Sunday, which the town received with the particular interest it reserved for developments it had not predicted. The creek ran low in April. Snowmelt still working through the hills above town, the cottonwoods just starting their first green. It was cold enough for their breath to show, and warm enough that the cold was not an argument against being outside. She told him about her father, who had been a man of few words and deep knowledge of horses, and who had taught her both by example and by handing her things to do, and then watching to see what she did with them. He told her about his mother, who had wanted him to practice medicine in an eastern city, and who had never quite reconciled herself to Wyoming, and how he had understood her reasons and made a different choice anyway, and how they had found, in the last few years, a kind of peace with the difference. Do you miss the city? She said. Occasionally, he said. I miss the medical library and a good restaurant on a winter evening. He paused. But I was not in the city, doing the work I should be doing. You knew that. Eventually, he said. It took longer than it should have. I'm a better learner in some areas than others. She looked at him sideways. You learn fast enough, she said. He caught the meaning and looked at her, and they held each other's gaze for a moment, with the directness that had been present since the first morning in the stable. The looking, that is not performance, but actual interest. Two people seeing each other plainly. People have been warning you about me, she said. Not a question. She had heard enough in 2 weeks to know the way Cutter's Creek moved. A few, he said. And I think Cutter's Creek has been looking at you with the wrong tools, he said, and drawing conclusions that belong to the tools, not to you. She was quiet for a moment. The creek moved past them, and the cottonwoods stirred in the cold April air, and the Wyoming sky above them was the particular pale blue of high country spring. I'm not easy, she said. This was not self-deprecation. It was accurate reporting. I know, he said. I'm not particularly easy either. I'm exacting about work, and I have no patience for people who cut corners, and I find small talk genuinely tedious, which has not always endeared me to my patients' families. He looked at the creek. I have been told on more than one occasion that I am too much in my head. Are you? Sometimes, he said. Less lately. She looked at the water. The thing she had known was absent from her life, whose shape she had understood without being able to name it, was walking beside her in the cold Wyoming spring, and she recognized it with the recognition that is not surprise but arrival, the feeling of a word you have been reaching for, suddenly being there. She did not say anything about this. She had never been a person who said things before. She was certain of them. She said, What made you take this posting specifically? There are other county physician positions. There are, he said. So why Cutter's Creek? He looked at the water for a moment. I had looked at 4 postings before I responded to this one, he said. The others were in better towns, by the measurements people usually apply, more established, more convenient, better facilities. He paused. I have never made decisions well by that kind of measurement. What measurement do you use? He turned and looked at her directly. Whether the thing in front of me is worth doing, he said. She held his gaze. Something passed between them that did not require words, which was fortunate because neither of them was inclined to use more words than a thing required. "That's a reasonable measurement," she said. "I think so," he said. They walked back to town in the comfortable quiet of two people who have discovered that the other person's silence is not emptiness but presence. May came, and with it the better weather and the increased work that spring brought to a livery stable in Wyoming, and Maren was busier than she had been in months, which suited her. She was a person who did better with more to do rather than less, and she had, since April, an additional quality of aliveness that she recognized without analyzing too closely, because she was practical about most things, including herself. James Aldridge had established himself in Cutter's Creek with the steady competence that good physicians establish themselves everywhere they go, which is not through dramatic gesture, but through showing up and doing the work correctly and being the person people could count on at 3 in the morning when something was wrong. The town had begun to trust him, which was the only thing that mattered, and which took exactly as long as it took. He came to the livery in the evenings when his work allowed. She came to the clinic twice with minor injuries from stable work, a cut along her palm from a buckle that needed closing and a bruised rib from a young horse's poorly timed movement, and both times she was direct about what had happened and what it needed, and he was direct about treating it. And both of them operated with the efficient mutual competence of two people who have no interest in theatrics and find this quality in each other restful rather than cold. It was a Saturday morning in early June when it changed, or when what had already changed became named. He had come to the stable earlier than usual, before she had opened for business, which she had not been expecting, and which she therefore found him already at the yard gate when she came down the stairs at 6 in the morning with her coffee and her day's plan already laid out in her head. He had a horse with him, not the bay which was fully sound and had been for a month, not the rental gray, whose right rear hoof had been corrected and who was now doing perfectly well. A different horse, a tall chestnut mare of considerable quality, 17 hands and deep through the chest, the kind of animal that requires room in all directions and carries herself with the loose authority of a horse that knows what she is. Maren stopped on the bottom step. She looked at the horse for a long moment. "Where did she come from?" she said. "I bought her," he said, 3 weeks ago from a rancher near Casper. "I've been keeping her at the Hollowell place while she settled." He paused. "Her name is Copper. She's 8 years old, bred in Colorado, the best gaited horse I have ever sat on. She's 17 hands." Maren looked at him. "She's the right height," he said. "I had her measured. I had her gaits assessed by the Hollowell boys, who are not generous with their praise and had nothing but good things to say. I checked her teeth and her feet and her history myself." He held the mare's lead rope. "She's been waiting 3 weeks because I wanted to be sure before I brought her here." The thing he was saying with all of this was apparent, and was also the kind of thing that required no elaboration, which was good, because she was standing on the bottom step of her own staircase with her morning coffee, and whatever she might have said had gone somewhere she couldn't immediately locate. "You bought a horse," she said. "I bought you a horse," he said, "if you'll have her." Maren came down the last step and walked to the mare and put out her hand, and Copper dropped her nose into it with the trusting ease of a well-handled animal, and she ran her hand up the mare's face and along her neck and felt the good solid warmth of a horse that is sound and well cared for and exactly what she appeared to be. She was taller than anything Maren had ridden in years. She was unmistakably the right size. She had not ridden for pleasure in 2 years, since the last horse she had borrowed for a Sunday ride had been, in the blunt way of practical men, not built for her height, too narrow in the back, uncomfortable for both of them, and she had brought him back early and not asked again. She looked at Copper for a long moment. Then she looked at James Aldridge, who was watching her with the quiet patience of a man who has done what he came to do and is prepared to wait for whatever comes next. "You did this 3 weeks ago," she said. "I did," he said, "before you said anything. I wanted to be certain first, he said. That she was right, that I was right. He paused. I am a thorough man. I noticed, she said. She gave him the coffee to hold. She put her foot in the stirrup, and she swung up onto Copper, and the mare stood solid and calm and unbothered, taking the weight with the certainty of an animal that is built for the job and knows it. Maren settled in the saddle and sat for a moment at the height she hadn't had in 2 years. The ground a proper distance below her, the mare steady under her, and she felt something release in her chest that she hadn't known was held. She looked down at James Aldridge, who was looking up at her with her coffee still in his hand and an expression she had come to know well enough to read. It was the expression of a man who has done a thing correctly and knows it, and beneath that something quieter and more permanent. Well, he said. She fits, she said. She does, he said. She rode Copper around the yard twice while James Aldridge stood at the gate and watched and did not feel the need to comment on what was evident. When she came back, she looked at him for a long moment from the mare's back. Ask me, she said. He looked up at her. You're certain? I am a thorough woman, she said. He asked her. She said yes. It was that simple and that sufficient. They were married in August in the small church on the east end of Cutter's Creek, a practical ceremony because Maren had no patience for ceremony that exceeded its own purpose, and James had spent enough years in places where the important things happened without any ceremony at all to have a clear sense of proportion. The wedding lasted 40 minutes and was followed by a supper at the church hall that Mrs. Baxter organized and that the whole town attended because Cutter's Creek attended everything, and because there was an additional quality of interest in attending the wedding of a woman the town had decided was past the possibility of this, and a man who had apparently made his own assessment and found the town's conclusions wanting. Theodora Hatch said afterward that she had known all along there was someone right for Maren Voss. She had simply not been able to see who. The rancher Pruett, who came through Cutter's Creek twice a year, arrived in September and received the news and rode on, which was appropriate and unremarkable. Maren's father had no chair by the fire to watch from, but she thought of him on the morning of the wedding, standing in the stable before she went to the church, with the particular quality of presence that people who have been loved keep after they are gone. He had been a man who showed his feelings through what he did rather than what he said. She understood, standing in the stable she had kept for him, that she had found a person who operated the same way, and that this was not an accident, but a recognition. James Aldridge ran the county physician's practice with the steadiness that had brought him there, and with an additional quality that good work acquires when the person doing it has a home worth returning to. He learned, over the following years, more about horses than he had known before, not because he had to, but because it interested him, and because Maren was a thorough teacher for the subjects she cared about. She learned in turn things about the body's capacity and its limits that she had not known, and which changed the way she thought about the work she did with animals and the patience she brought to it. She rode Copper every Saturday morning. This became the fixed point of her week, and then simply the way things were, visible and unremarkable, a woman on a tall chestnut mare on the roads around Cutter's Creek, going wherever she was going with the ease of someone who has found the right fit after a long time of making do with less. The Voss livery sign stayed as it was, because it had been her father's name first and she had not changed it when she took over, and she saw no reason to change it now. James did not suggest she should. He understood without being told that some things are not about the present moment but about the thread that runs through time, and that honoring the thread is not the same as refusing to move forward. The town's opinion revised itself, as small-town opinions do, without announcement or acknowledgement, or any admission that a revision was occurring. She was spoken of with the particular warmth that communities reserve for people who have found where they belong. She was capable, they said, meaning it now as the full and accurate compliment it had always been. She was exactly suited to her life, which she had always been. It had simply taken the right man, thorough and unhurried, to come through a stable door and see it clearly.